Hello St John's and welcome back for another chapter of the Roman Mysteries. We are now on scroll 12. "I told you never to come in here," shouted Avitus. He was rigid with anger and his heavy eyebrows made him look very fierce, but his anger was directed at his wife, not at Flavia and Lupus. "But Publius," Julia protested, "these children were her friends. I was just showing them—" "Get out," Avitus commanded his wife. For a tense moment they stared at one another. "No, I will not," Julia finally said. "She was my daughter too. You're not the only one who misses her." "Yes, but you'll see her again one day in paradise, won't you?" There was bitter sarcasm in Avitus's voice. "That doesn't mean I don't miss her now, Publius." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Just as much as you do." Suddenly her husband sagged. The anger drained from his face and he began to weep. "It's my fault she died," he cried. "If I had been here, I wasn't even here when she—" Julia Firma went to her husband and put her arms round him. "Of course it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. You must forgive yourself, Publius." Avitus and his wife wept in each other's arms, and Flavia felt her own eyes prickle with tears. Lupus cleared his throat to attract her attention and made a tiny movement with his head towards the stairs. Flavia nodded and the two of them squeezed past the weeping couple and hurried quietly downstairs. They passed through the narrow garden and dark atrium, stepping carefully over the toddlers, and let themselves out. As the door closed behind them, Flavia shivered and stood silently for a moment in the hot street, soaking up the intense warmth of the afternoon sun. The next moment they heard the sound of feet pounding the pavement and looked up to see Nubia and Jonathan running towards them. "Head gone," said Nubia, who reached them first, and when Jonathan stood before them, wheezing and unable to speak, she said again, "Dog's head is gone." The four friends stood in the graveyard and looked at the bodies of the two dead dogs under the tree. The corpses had already been picked at by crows. Now ants were doing their work too. Flavia instinctively averted her eyes and then forced herself to look back. There were two bodies, a brown one and a black one, but only one head. The mastiff's big head had disappeared. "Perhaps a crow carried it off," Jonathan suggested. Flavia gave him a sceptical look. "Too heavy. It's more likely your father took it to the magistrate for some reason." "I don't think so. Remember," he said, "even the blood might be dangerous. Perhaps one of the dogs from the pack carried it off." "Perhaps," Jonathan sounded doubtful. Lupus cautiously searched the dry weeds around the leader's headless body. Then he crouched down and sniffed. "Any clues, Lupus?" Flavia asked him. He shook his head. "Better get away from those corpses," said a deep voice. The four of them jumped. Behind them 2 soldiers stood leaning on shovels and perspiring heavily in the heat. "We're to dispose of them as soon as possible," said the taller one of the two. "Orders of the magistrate." He thrust his shovel into the dry ground. "Did you take the black dog's head?" Flavia asked when she had recovered from her surprise. "No, sweetheart, why should we do that?" His shovel sliced into the ground again. "Well, it's not here and I just wondered—" "She's right, Rufus," said the short one, who was leaning on his spade. "There's a missing head." "You'll be missing a head too if you don't start helping me dig." "What did you find out at Avitus?" whispered Jonathan as they stood in the shade of a pine watching the soldiers work. "Nothing much. Her parents both miss her, but her mother believes that she's gone to some wonderful garden with a shepherd." Jonathan gave Flavia an odd look. She added, "Avitus came in when we were in her room and got very angry. He does have a bad temper." "We already know that," murmured Jonathan, and then added thoughtfully, "We must find out more about him. If only we could follow him." Lupus tugged hopefully at Jonathan's tunic and pointed eagerly at himself. "Thanks for offering to follow him, Lupus, but I think he'd recognise you now that he's seen you." Lupus' response was to bend down, pick up a handful of twigs and dust and smear them over his face. "Oh, Lupus," cried Flavia, "just after we got you cleaned up." "He's right," cried Jonathan. "Everybody knows the beggar boy at the junkman's stall, and no one ever takes any notice of him. Dressed like a beggar, Lupus is as good as invisible." He slapped Lupus on the back and said, "Better take off those sandals and my bulla and put on your own tunic again." When Lupus had been restored to his former filthy state, they left him sitting in the shade of a mulberry tree within sight of Avitus' front door. Flavia gave him his last instructions. "When Avitus comes out of his house, if he comes out, follow him at a distance and look for any suspicious behaviour. If he leaves, Use this piece of chalk to make an arrow on the tree trunk to show which way you've gone. Here's some bread and cheese in case you get hungry. Better put them out of sight." Lupus slipped them into a little cloth pouch tied to the belt of his tunic. "Sure you don't mind just sitting here and waiting?" asked Jonathan. Lupus shook his head. "We'll try to find out more about Avitus too," Flavia told Lupus. "We'll all meet back at my house an hour before sunset to discuss our findings. Agreed?" Lupus nodded. Flavia, Nubia and Jonathan set off back down the road. As they passed their house, Nubia said to Flavia, "Take Scuto." Flavia hesitated. Someone was killing dogs and she didn't want anything to happen to him. Her father had always told her never to venture into the city without Scuto, but surely if there were 3 of them, they wouldn't come to any danger. "I think he's safer at home with Cordex and Alma," she decided. "Shouldn't you tell them where you're going?" suggested Jonathan. "If I do, they'll never let us go," said Flavia. "Come on." Lupus sat under the shade of the mulberry tree and looked up and down the street. It was the hottest part of the day. Most people would be napping in their cool gardens or relaxing at the baths. The street shimmered with heat as Lupus watched the others disappear round the bend in the road. A flash of movement caught his eye as a slave emptied a chamber pot from an upstairs window. A splash and the squeak of wooden shutters being shut again, and then silence, apart from the chirring of the cicadas. Lupus thought about Flavia and her friends for a while. Then he thought of all the food he'd eaten in the past few hours. He usually hated food. He couldn't taste it, it was difficult to chew, and every bite threatened to choke him if he didn't swallow carefully. But when he had been presented with grapes and bread and honey and buttermilk, his body had craved it so badly that he had eaten in spite of the danger. Now his belly was full and content. He felt sleepy too. The slow rhythmic creaking of the cicadas in the hot summer afternoon made him feel drowsy. His eyelids grew heavy and almost shut. He shook himself awake angrily. That was one advantage to being hungry all the time. It gave you an edge, an alertness. His sense of smell was always sharper if he hadn't eaten for a day or two. His eyesight was keener too. Was this how ordinary people felt most of the time? Full and content and muzzy. He had smeared his face with dust and dirt, but under his dirty old tunic his skin felt soft and clean, his muscles loose and relaxed. He could still smell the sandalwood oil they had massaged him with. It made him feel soft and vulnerable. The itching of vermin always used to help him stay alert and awake, but now there were no lice in his clothing and no nits in his hair. He reached up and stroked his head and felt the soft stubble. It felt nice. How good it would be to live in a beautiful house like Flavia's and always have a full belly and clean clothes, and to be able to nap during the hottest part of the afternoon in a cool garden by a splashing fountain, or go to the baths whenever you wanted and swim in pools of crystal clear water with mosaics of sea nymphs at the bottom, and have all your aches massaged away. How wonderful never to have to worry about where your next meal would come from, never to have to worry about people who wanted to hurt you, and never to have to worry about being lonely. Lupus's eyes closed, and for a moment he began to slip into this delicious oblivion of sleep. Suddenly he started awake. Something had moved in the hot, deserted street. The red door was opening. A man closed it behind him and turned to go north towards the Roman gate. It was Avitus, and he was alone. Join me in again for another chapter. Bye for now.